Yep. Good afternoon, everybody. I think you can hear me. I can certainly hear myself. So if you want to just take the last few seats. We've got really limited time in terms of turning over from speaker to speaker, so we're going to get right into it. And just let you know, my name is Michelle English. I'm the manager of the Climate Change Unit in JUMA, and I have the honour today of chairing and keeping our presenters to time. And I will be ruthless because otherwise everyone will be heading off to drinks while Paul Murray's trying to speak at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Peter Day. He's speaking on Rethinking Climate Adaptation Planning, turning awareness into action. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Peter Day. I'm a natural resources consultant. I'm presenting today in conjunction with a couple of colleagues, Wayne Meyer and Mark Steventry. The three of us have worked together and also separately on a number of projects to try to plan for climate change. And we've worked across a couple of states and for a range of clients. We were chatting one day and we sort of thought, look, in all of these, reflecting on what we've done, we felt fairly comfortable that we'd raised awareness, we've done some tricky science, we've certainly generated a few insights, but we weren't confident that we'd achieved the sort of traction that we were really after. Perhaps the level of change we were seeing was appropriate, perhaps it wasn't. Anyhow, it led us to think about what would we do if we're doing these exercises again, what tips would we have for young players. So that, in short, is what today's about, just our thoughts on reflecting on our work and how we think we could better move from awareness to action. That's obviously the wrong one. Points we'll run through. Planning is always an uncertain thing. We don't know what the future is going to be. We're very used to dealing with uncertainty in all the things we do. So nothing really new in that. But in climate change, there are a few things which are a little bit special. Some uncertainties there which we need to acknowledge and take special steps to deal with. There have been a number of tools developed to help us deal with that uncertainty, and we've found them to be quite useful. We wouldn't rely on them on their own. We really think the best solutions are combining some traditional planning tools, tweaking them a little bit and fitting them in with some of these newer tools. So the tricky bits about climate change, firstly we don't know what the future climate's going to be. We don't know how we're going to interact with the atmosphere and hence what the climate will be. We're dealing with complex systems. Most of the work we've been doing has been at the landscape scale. So we're looking at that mix of environment, social, economic, climate all in there. Even if we knew precisely what the future climate was going to be, we don't know some of those other aspects. So it's still very tricky to get a head around what we're dealing with. The other one is the time frames. 20, 50, 70 years in the future are figures we're often dealing with. A lot of people really have difficulty grappling with that. The other one we're still dealing with is the wide range of views about climate change. While we might think of deniers versus the true believers, there's actually a lot in between too. We'll believe some bits and not others, or have different viewpoints. So it really complicates the engagement process. A couple of the tools that have been developed in this area, vulnerability assessment. Are people familiar with that or not? Yep, okay. So a useful process to work through, and I guess the exposure sensitivity part's a bit like a traditional risk analysis, with the addition there of talking about adaptive capacity. Have we got the ability to change the exposure of the asset we're looking at, or can we change how sensitive it is in some way? We've found that concept of adaptive capacity a really useful thing. Framework lends itself to high-tech or low-tech approaches, and do it spatially and non-spatially. It's quite a useful framework to keep working through. The other one's the pathways planning. And this approach is really about an if-then. It accepts that we don't know what the future is. It says if it's this, then we'd probably be doing these things. If it's this, then we'll do something different. And the little mud maps are a neat little way of sort of showing that. And anyhow, if I could point, I'd point up here and say that the top line there looks at something like this is one for looking with vegetation management. The top line refers to pest control, sort of things that have always been done. We see that continuing on in the future. If we come down a couple, one of the lines is revegetation of current species. And that's something that will probably happen for a while. After a time though, we might find the climate's not suiting those species anymore, and we need to think about changing to re-veg with a different mix of species. So it helps us just plot that out, and also to think about what would trigger that decision point. The other thing it really does is get us thinking about the precursor. If we want to start using a different mix of species in the future, how will we decide what those species are? What guidelines will we follow? Who do we need to consult with on that? So we can start doing that work now in preparation for that point when it arises. So again, we found that quite a useful tool. There are increasingly a whole lot of analysis going on all aspects of the environment and how it might change under different climates. And again, they're all good information coming through from these things. And we found them all useful, but none of them really do the job on their own. Some of the traditional tools that we found we think will help a lot. Scenario planning, business planning tool that's been around for many decades. Encourages you to think about a couple of alternative different futures, pulling them out so that you can start to say, well, if the world's like this in the future, or if it's like this, what would we be doing? So very good early on in the planning process. Another one we found handy, mind maps, conceptual models. People usually engage with this quite well. It's a bit of fun, thinking through if we change this, what else happens. The real value of them is that it highlights assets that are often impacted in a number of different ways and starts to get you really thinking about how you might deal with that. And it really highlights those interactions coming through. So again, a useful planning tool, particularly in the early stages. Another tool we've dusted off and brought back is the Driver Pressure State Impact Response Framework. It's again a framework that's been around for a long time. Some countries use that for their state of environment reporting. It talks about if we've got a driver like increased CO2 levels through to a pressure, hotter and drier climate, in this case a state, change in their veg communities, the impact would be more erosion, changes to water runoff, etc. And the useful thing we've found here, is that value in its own, but really the responses, what would we do? More carbon planting, we're going to need to do different fire management systems, reseeding post the fires, etc., and so on. So we've really found that bottom line response side of that was good at stimulating people to think through about how can we respond to climate change. So the main points for these that think about different futures and really that what if approach. If this, then we do this. The thought around those decision points. When am I going to decide it's time to bring in some different species from a re-veg mix? What are going to be the triggers that tell me that? Is it a change in the survival rate of our current re-veg work? Whatever it is, start to think about what is going to trigger it and monitor for that. Think now about acting now and building that capacity for change. And this is a very dynamic area. Our understanding keeps changing. So it's a really active review of these on a fairly regular basis, not just a sort of a dust off. We think you probably need to go back to basics again almost in 5 years' time. So I've talked through those main recommendations. Now thinking we had a number of supporting recommendations, and I'll just touch on a couple of those now. First one's engagement. I mentioned that it's quite complex in this area. Probably traditional engagement models are difficult to work through. We tend to think that you'll get much better results by focusing on key decision makers. They're the people that can make decisions and lead organisations. The other thing is that part of this is about cultural change. We would love to move from having a standalone climate adaptation plan to seeing that embedded wherever we were doing. That means a change in the culture of organisations, and that's got to start at the top. So it's about engaging those leaders in organisations to start to work through that. I think you can generate these changes through the community process as well. It's sort of what we're doing as project consultants or coming in as one-off. We don't really have that capacity. That's a much longer term change mechanism. Vulnerability assessments. It's a subjective process and the scoring is quite subjective. When you get into it though, you often get sucked into thinking, I need more detail, I've got to chase this a little bit further. I advise us to step back, appreciate that this is quite subjective. This is just one means to an end, it's not an end in itself. You're getting a whole range of things to generate information. So don't get drawn too far into chasing detail in these. And the last couple, transformational change. Earlier on we talked about pest control, those sort of activities, see them being important in the future. Organisations often look at this and say, oh great, tick, we're doing that, no need to worry any further. The challenge really is what you're doing now going to survive the extra pressures and stresses of climate change? How can you move from, say, an 80-90% sort of success rate in what you're doing through to something up towards 100%? How can you get that excellence into your programs? Response ready, solutions at hand when a trigger point arrives. A good example might be foreshore development. You might have identified that there are a number of assets under threat from coastal erosion. The community's not quite prepared to do anything about that yet. It's almost a matter of waiting for those big storms that come in and leave you with a big engineering bill to try and protect those resources. At that time, with planning, you can step in and say, not going to happen. We can see that this is actually climate change coming into effect here. We've already identified these 3 possible relocation sites. We can start some discussion about that. And we have a discussion paper ready for release all about a whole range of new planning approaches that we can bring in quite quickly. So it's being a response ready thing. And I've talked before about the commitment of some of those key decision makers. And again, is not just endorsing a plan, but committing to their role in implementing it. It might be as simple as, I'm going to change the culture of my organisation in this way. I'm going to lock in that. Sorry. Got the message. To lock in that level of commitment that's needed. So these plans don't just sit there, they're actually driven. When the money dries up, the organisations are still locked into driving these plans. So the conclusions, that mix of traditional planning and the new tools that are always coming out, focus on their high level understanding and a number of things to get action going so that plans don't just sit on the library shelf. Myself, Wayne and Mark would be quite happy to talk to anyone at any time later on if you've got any queries about the work we've been doing and thoughts on how to take some of these ideas into action. Thank you.